If we're talking from a merger's point of view, so to speak, I think there's only so much consolidation that has potential to happen, right? And I feel like maybe you're thinking a bit broader in terms of what you think in terms of consolidation.
I don't know how much, how much merger acquisition consolidation will happen, or should happen. I think it's interesting that there's a couple of like pins, there's a couple of kind of hubs, networks and companies that are working and doing, and then there's a bunch of independent stuff too. And so I think there's ways that we can
Sure.
engage with the independent podcasts as well. I think that's something that's interesting. And then if you think about podcasts, the podcast industry has three kind of main pillars, right? You have the content, you have the tech, and you have the monetization. If you look at those three, Salt has been almost entirely focused on the content side of that. And that is something that we're, for the most part, mostly focused on. The other
Of
parts we're
course. Yeah.
working with partners on, to build out, the required, requirements for those other pillars. So I think there's still a lot of room to grow. And for us as like, if we consider ourselves as like a ecosystem partner, um, then, our goal as well is to grow the whole ecosystem. So we want that whole pie to grow. So, when you have a company close down, this makes me very sad. It's not something that we celebrate, and something that, oh, some competition now there's, no, this is not a good thing. This is a bad thing for the ecosystem. We want that ecosystem to grow fully, and together. So this is something that, that we keep an eye on and that we're tracking. And I think it's really good to see that there's a couple of new players, some new networks, a lot of individual podcasts popping up, and that those are all healthy signs.
For me, I think there are some very visible gaps in the ecosystem, especially regionally.
Mm,
Right, education is a big one, of course. You mentioned. I still think also a lack of content. There isn't enough yet, right?
I would agree with that.
So yeah, and then as you mentioned, there's a lot of space to grow in that area too. But I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think are maybe some of the gaps or some of the challenges that are still, we're still not down addressing.
I mean, I would agree, first and foremost, as, an organization that focuses on content production and producing content, first and foremost, that there, you know, we haven't reached anywhere close to a saturation of
Yeah,
podcasts
exactly.
in the region. And when I say in the region, like I mean in our geographic region, but also in the languages of our region, and
Sure.
many languages, not just English or Arabic. There's other languages as well. So I think that's really important to consider. And I think too, if you look at really successful ecosystems, like TikTok or Instagram or whatnot, there is a financial element that is in there. And so I think that's something that we're still lacking. There isn't that financial reward. It doesn't, but I also think that there's other rewards, and so, for us, like I said, having a productive conversation is really important in this day and age, for our societies. No matter how you see that society, like it's really important to have
Absolutely.
productive
Yeah, yeah.
conversations with each other. So that's something that we think is a core piece of that. I would also say, the debate or the conversation about audio and video, is almost pointless and not very useful. I think there's
Yeah,
different
agreed.
types of content, and when we say podcast, we mean a podcast. Like it means like people talking or narrative, whether they're video or not video. I think they're both useful and interesting and can be extremely sticky. People will want to listen to that and come back to it. So we're doing, more video, but we're also our narrative shows are the audiences are growing. Our audience doubled from 2022 to 2023. We're going to try to double that again in 2024. So we don't see those issues in the sense that, the numbers are smaller or whatnot. I would say, there probably are, very few examples of podcast tech projects in the region.
Yeah, I don't.
There's just
That's so interesting.
maybe like two,
I don't know why that is, but it is. Yeah.
right? Maybe there's just like two or three different kind of tech projects, that I know about, and one of them is a recent kind of transformation, Thamenya from more of a content company to
Right.
a web content tech company.
Sure.
And then there's a couple of others that, started and stayed in the tech area. And then, so I think there's those two. And then if you follow that kind of three pillars of the podcast ecosystem, I would say there's probably not enough, monetization opportunities happening either. And that's probably something we can agree on. And so there needs to be more people working in that as well. More education. And like I
I think
said, the goal is to grow that pie. It's not just to get a bigger piece of a small pie, but it's to make that whole pie much bigger.
I agree. I think I'm with you on the video audio conversation too, right? I think there's so much energy that's spent on that conversation that it's I think for me it's very clear, right? I think it works for some shows, it doesn't work for others. You have to figure out if there's a fit, there's an overhead that you add that it may or may not be worth it depending on the kind of show you're doing and depending on the economics of I mean, there's it is a business decision to a large degree.
Right.
And then in some cases, it's a very easy business decision, and others, it's not actually. There is something to be said, and you brought this up earlier, right, about the RSS part of podcasting that is
Mm,
actually very powerful and impactful, and I think to some degree also contributes to the challenges we're seeing, right? Because there
right.
you can't
For sure.
consolidate something that isn't consolidatable, if
Right.
that's a word, right?
Right.
So when you mentioned TikTok as an example, it is still a closed ecosystem. Everything happens
Sure.
inside the platform, and that makes it faster to grow in terms of looking at an ecosystem, but then of course it comes with its own challenges, right? Whether it's and we've seen this in YouTube and so many other platforms where you have issues because the platform's goals don't always align with the creator's goals, right?
Right.
And so I think that itself is it's funny. It's like it's one of its most powerful things, and yet it's one of its biggest challenges, right? Because it makes I know that I'm sure you've had these conversations with actually not just advertisers but just companies, right, where it's like that's all the data we're going to get, and I'm like, yeah, that's all the data you're going to get, but this is good enough to
Yeah.
get somewhere with what you're trying to do, because it's a very, as you said, it's a sticky listen, right? It's a more qualified listen. So
Right.
of course there's education that has to happen around that. So I
Right.
think that's where kind of things have to still move. Like you mentioned, monetization is a big deal, and I think it isn't quite mature enough yet. And we're not, again, it's very easy to look at places like the US, but they're very mature in terms of things like subscriptions for content and in every tier. And here, it's not just enough to have a subscription; we also have to educate,
Right.
around it. So it's quite complex.
Yeah, I would, obviously agree with a lot of that. And I think, we've seen some attempts to create walled gardens around open technology,
Yeah,
Spotify being the biggest. They're trying to get a lot of that content into there and exclusive and whatnot. And they've, recently kind of unrolled that strategy. They've rolled it back.
I think that was always going to be the case. I don't think there isn't this. I mean, I think there'll always be some space for sort of the quote unquote walled garden, right? I
Yeah,
think there will be some room for someone to come in, get a bunch of audience and say, okay, well, now you can only get this within my whatever it is, right? Platform, gate, whatever.
right,
But I think the larger ecosystem and everything else around it will continue to thrive,
right,
irrespective of what happens there. I don't think you're going to see, at least I can't see it happening where 98% of podcast listening is going to happen on one platform,
right.
and there's going to be nothing else. I think it's far more split.
I mean, you had other examples too where people were trying to bring all the content into an app, and spent, tons of money. I think it was called Luminary, right? Where they spent
Yes.
all this money to get all this content, and they had like very few subscribers. I think they killed it so quickly that they realized so quickly that this is not going to work. And so, moving forward, what I would like to see is more distribution of the revenue, from advertising and sponsorships to subscription. And I think subscription can add value, and I think there will be certain ways and places where subscription is going to be an important part, of our businesses. And I think, for Salt, we are going to relaunch Salt Plus, with a different strategy, in the coming two
Okay.
months. And we're also going to launch a couple of new products that are going to be subscription only, and we're going to really go and we're going to drill down on that. And we think we found a couple of audio products that work best in subscription and not freemium or another other way. There's certain places you don't want advertising. There's certain things that you
Mhm.
do not want, exposure to brands and to kind of, whatever ad server
Sure.
delivers at that moment. And so we're going to look at some of those opportunities and see what we can build that could be, financially successful. And also again, remembering that quality and the content is really important and how those two things can meet in subscription. So we're also going to focus on that, a lot in the coming year. And we're going to test some things out and see how it goes.
Yeah, and I think it is that sort of essential pivot to content company, right?
Mm,
Versus calling yourself a podcast house. I mean, this is I love podcasts, and I don't mean that they're going anywhere, right? But I think the idea of from a business standpoint, thinking one level up, right? To say, okay, here's a piece of content that I want to be able to deliver, and then figure out what's the best way to do it.
right.
And that might be two different forms of audio. It can be audio or video. It can be. I mean, I think there's a lot of scope to start thinking strategically that way.
Right.